Hi there, and welcome to Fabulous Creations. I'm Ron Farber Newman, and today we're going back in time a little bit. I haven't got a DeLorean, but I do have a hard drive full of various project footage going back a few years. You see, even though this video is getting produced and edited in 2019, without any regularity over the past few years, I would occasionally film myself working on a project figuring, hey, this might make a cool video someday. Now that I've actually started my channel, I figured that hard drive deserved a looking through, and I found what seems to be the entire process of me creating a custom wedding name sign as a gift for my cousin Emily and her now husband Alex back in September of 2017. Let's take a look, shall we? Alex and Emily were having a barn wedding in a semi-rural part of the Midwest, so I thought it would be an interesting challenge to design for their theme, which I had gotten a sneak peek of through their invitation. They used one of those sort of Pinteresty script fonts for primary lettering and a typical serif font for the primary text. While I really like rustic chic decor, it's not something I'd really done before, so as you'll soon see, I went through quite a few design iterations. When making wedding signs, I typically like to make the last name the most prominent part, with the first names above and the date of the wedding below. But this project posed a challenge that I hadn't really run into before, and that was the shortness of their last name. Lane. Just 4 letters. It may not be immediately clear why a short name poses a design challenge, but you'll see that you can only scale the last name so big before it just looks awkwardly sized compared to everything else. It has a lot to do with the aspect ratio of the word when typed out. The shorter the name, the closer to square the name is, meaning that as you make the word wider, it gets taller at a much faster rate than a longer name would. I played with the kerning a bit and tried a few fonts that were just wider in general, but I wasn't happy with either of those options. The solution for short last names, as it turns out, was to not make the last name the most prominent focal point, but instead the couple's first names. The last name was still there, but delegated to the spot above the first names. Since it no longer read fluidly from top to bottom, I thought prepending the word "the" to the front of the last name worked well to highlight the last name in its own way. As I'm designing signs like this, I like to plop in temporary colors for what I imagine the final colors will look like in the finished sign, to help me get a better sense of where the design is at. I was also really eager to do something interesting with the shape of the sign itself. I had designed a handful of signs at this point that were pretty formal in their outer shape, inset scoop corners, fancy border radiuses, etc. And since this was meant to be more rustic, I thought I would explore a more informal approach to the sign's overall shape. It took me a bit to get there, but being that this was meant to be inspired by rustic barnwood chic, I decided to try a staggered plank or floorboard approach, as though the backing piece was made up of multiple boards, even if it wasn't. After shuffling the boards around until they were perfectly random, I started to second guess the typeface I had selected for the primary lettering, mostly because it had a few too many flourishes for my taste, and I wanted to tone that aspect of it down. I tried a few different fonts, but none of them were quite as good as the one I'd already chosen, so I decided to tackle the problem head on and modify the letters that I didn't like. It was primarily the E in Emily and the A in Alex that I didn't like, so I went through and removed the extra accents that made the letters too busy for me. I'd also started adding an apostrophe to the lanes until a quick Google search revealed that that was improper grammar. Oops, that was a close one. Once I was fully happy with the design, it was time to prep it for the laser cutter. The laser cutter I use at the makerspace I attend is an old full spectrum laser, and the software is a bit finicky, so proper setup of my file is key. Over the years, I've learned that shapes can't have fills and strokes, or it will double up the toolpaths and cut everything twice. The same thing happens if the stroke weight in Illustrator is wider than 0.25 points in width. I like to break my design up into multiple layers so that when printing from my layered PDF, I can choose which layers I want on at a given time. Changing the colors of the stroke for each layer also gives me the ability to have different cut settings for each color. For the dividing lines in between the adjoining planks, I created these from the rectangles themselves before merging a copy of them into one solid chunk. This way, the outer backing board could be cut out together, and then the lines could be etched on top to give the appearance of separate pieces of wood. With my file mostly prepped, it was time to prep my materials. Since the goal of the backing board was to look rustic like barnwood, the challenge was to make that happen without actually having any legit real barnwood at my disposal. I would have to make faux barnwood. I took a few pieces of pine cut to approximate size, and with a wire brush and my drill, took to the boards to heavily distress them. I also beat them up a bit with the back of my hammer, and then smoothed out the dents a bit with a wire brush. The wire brush was really key here, as it effectively allowed me to sand in between the lines of the grain that made up the early wood and the late wood of the board. This would happen naturally over time in real barnwood, as the early wood is softer and more prone to wear. If you've ever encountered an old weathered board, it more than likely had this rigid bumpy grain that you could feel with your hand. With the board properly textured, it was time to give it the right color, too. I'd researched a handful of ways in which you could faux age wood, but a common theme was iron acetate, which may sound fancy, but it's just steel wool dissolved in vinegar. Unfortunately, I didn't record myself making it, but I stored my solution in a mason jar, and it smells exactly like you think it would. Rusty Pickles. There's a free band name for whoever wants it. There's a chemical reaction that people smarter than me can explain better than me. The way I understand it, the tannins in the wood react with this iron acetate to darken and gray the wood. Certain woods have a really high tannin content, such as oak, while other boards, like pine, have a lower tannin content. For this project, I needed to use pine though, which I'll explain why later, but thankfully there's a way to help supplement pine's lackluster tannin content with a simple cup of piping hot, strong black tea. Tea is loaded with this stuff, tannins that is, and so before applying the iron acetate, a healthy coat of tea is applied first. After the tea had soaked in and dried, it was time for the magic of the iron acetate and tannins to do their work. What goes on relatively lightly is transformed to a dark pigment literally before your eyes, and it's really quite neat to watch. It also gets a bit darker as it completes its reaction and dries, so don't fret if it's not super dark right away. In my case, I felt it was too dark after drying, so I decided to sand it back a little bit with a Brillo pad. This took off a good amount of finish without being so aggressive that it exposed the bare wood underneath, like sandpaper would. In my design file, I originally imagined the secondary lettering, their last name and wedding date, to be black, but I was aware that it might be too dark to read easily or clearly, so I did a test cut with bare wood and another test cut with dark stained wood. The dark stained wood just didn't have the contrast I wanted, so I decided to use the lighter stuff. But since I was also using light colored wood for the primary lettering, their first names, I didn't want it to be identical in color, so I used a light colored stain to help give the birch plywood a colonial maple golden hue for just a slight bit of contrast. Here's the unfinished birch and the stained piece side by side for comparison. I didn't show it in my design process, but I will often gather and rearrange the various letters to optimize the space on a single piece of wood as to minimize the scrap. Here you can see the ampersand getting nice and cozy with the Alex and Emily pieces. Most pieces coming out of the laser need a little bit of sanding to remove the smoke that settles on the surface of the wood near the cuts. This can be reduced by good air assist blowing at the wood as it cuts and by good ventilation to suck the smoke out of the laser cutter. But it will always happen a little bit, and it's something a good sanding can't fix. Large sheets of sandpaper help for this. I will occasionally leave a faint hint of the smoke visible to kind of let the finished piece own its origin, so to speak. After confirming the lettering looked good on the prepared backing board, it was time to cut that next. So I mentioned earlier that it was important to be able to use pine for the backing board. Let me explain why. Most laser cutters can only cut wood that's around 1/4 inch or thinner, even more so for hardwoods. There just isn't enough energy to cut past that amount of thickness very cleanly. Well, I wanted the sign to have a little heft, so I used a 3/4 inch piece of pine. In past experiments, I discovered that pine was exempt from that 1/4 inch guideline since it was so soft. The laser could essentially cut it like butter. But there was a little trick to make that cut cleaner. Laser light is a super focused light beam, but because it's super focused, the range where the light energy is at its peak power is pretty tight, especially in a laser cutter where the light is bounced around on a handful of mirrors and then finally refocused before making its way to the wood. As a result, if you could see it with your naked eye, the beam forms sort of an hourglass shape, essentially two cones stacked on top of each other. Where those two cones meet in the middle is where the light is most focused and you'll get the cleanest cuts. But the areas immediately above and below the cone still have quite a bit of energy, just not as much. So with that little lesson of laser light in mind, normally when you're cutting an 1/8 inch piece or 1/4 inch piece of wood, for example, you would focus the laser on the surface of the wood to get the sharpest line possible. But since this 3/4 inch piece of pine was quite a bit thicker than normal cutting thickness, I learned to focus the laser in the middle of the board. I did this by focusing on the surface of the wood first, and then raising the cut bed by 3/8 of an inch, which is exactly half the thickness of my board, so that the tightest focus of energy would be at the center, therefore splitting the difference of dissipated energy to be a little bit on both the top and bottom of my board. I should note that I used the slight defocusing technique to laser the lines in between the boards. By having the laser out of focus, and turning the power down pretty low, I was able to get a nice thick dark line that scorched the top of the wood instead of what would have otherwise been a thin tiny cut in the surface. After the outline was cut, I very lightly lasered a copy of the primary and secondary text paths on top of the board to serve as guides for myself when gluing, to ensure everything was perfectly spaced. When it comes to thick cuts like this, it's not always clear right away if the laser made it all the way through or if another pass is needed to finish the cut. In these cases, I'm always careful to hold the piece firmly in place as I make sure the scrap comes loose of it. This way I don't accidentally move the design should it need to be in the same spot for another pass. In this case, it was all good, so I was able to remove the cut backing board and inspect my work. The final pieces to cut were my golden stained secondary lettering, which I had also prepped to optimize space on my wood. Now it was time for final assembly so I could see it in its final form. I put a good blob of glue down and used it to sort of finger paint the glue onto the small individual letters and numbers and pressed firmly until it no longer wanted to slide away on me. After I did 5 or so letters in a row, I used a steel plate to clamp things down while I worked on the next series of letters. This is a pretty slow process, but it's also semi-meditative. There aren't many moments in woodworking that are safe to let your mind wander and think about other things, but slow-glowing, repetitive glue-ups are definitely one of them. For the primary lettering, it was a large enough surface area that I decided to employ the help of a small paintbrush to apply the glue. I decided to forego any top coat to complement the rustic nature of the design, so after all the glue was dried, it was time to apply the mounting hardware. I prefer picture hanging wire most of the time as I find it's easier for the recipient to get it on the wall and get it leveled. I also add adhesive felt pads to balance the vertical tilt that the wire adds and to prevent their wall from getting scuffed underneath the sign. You'll also see here my original naming idea for these woodworking projects and eventual YouTube channel of mine. But Farber Made just didn't have the ring I wanted, hence my shift to Fabulous Creations. So just imagine this says Fabulous Creations. There. Perfect. Alex and Emily, if I ever get stickers made, I'll send you one so you can put it over the etched logo on the back that literally no one will ever see. Unfortunately, I didn't take any glamorous footage of the finished sign hanging up, but I did take some really nice photos for my portfolio, so the big reveal here will be a bit old school PowerPoint style. And here she is. I was really happy with how this turned out. It had all the character and charm I was going for, while not being so rustic that it would look out of place in a modern home. All that was left at this point was wrapping up in bubble wrap and craft paper and delivering it to the new Mr. and Mrs. Lane. It was a beautiful wedding, and I was honored to take part in their special day. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed that in-depth look at the process behind making a custom name sign like that. I put a lot of heart into every one I make, so hopefully that shows in my process. These are the types of projects I really love to do, and I can't wait to share more of them with you in the future. If you like this video, I sure would appreciate if you gave me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. It'll let me know that this is the type of video people like watching and encourage me to make more like it in the future. And if you do want to see more like this in the future, be sure to hit the bell icon too so YouTube notifies you the next time I release a video. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Until next time, cheers.